Hey everyone, professional photographer Ian Plant here, and in this video I am going to be reviewing Tamron's 35 to 150 millimeter lens for Sony E-mount cameras. It's a full frame camera lens and it's a really excellent lens, and I think if you're using a Sony system you should definitely consider this lens for your camera bag. It's got a lot of different uses, and if you want to learn more, then stay tuned. Hey, how's it going everyone? I have been using Tamron's 35 to 150 millimeter lens for the past few months in a variety of challenging locations. So I took this with me on my trip to Madagascar. I was there for a month photographing landscapes and wildlife, and most recently I was in Grand Teton National Park, and I use this lens quite a bit. So I feel like I've got a pretty good sense about its strengths and its weaknesses and what you might be using this lens for. And to me, that's the most important thing. This review isn't going to cover all of the technical aspects of the lens. I'm not going to be doing any MTF graphs or anything like that. I will talk about the technical characteristics of the lens, but it's more of a subjective review, and that's what this review is really all about. It's about the creative aspects of using this lens. So I'm going to talk about the creative opportunities that this lens opens up and how it might differ from using other lenses, and what are the types of photography that you're going to want to use this lens for. So before we get started with the review, I just wanted to disclose with you a pre-existing financial arrangement that I have with Tamron. They are one of my sponsor partners. I've been working with them for many years, used a lot of their different lenses, and over the years they have given me free lenses, and they have paid me for a number of presentations and other things that I've done for them. So I do have this pre-existing relationship. I wanted you to be aware of it. Now, Tamron isn't directly compensating me for this review. They haven't told me what to say, and I wouldn't listen to them anyways because I try to keep these reviews independent and honest. But I just wanted to let you know that Tamron is one of my corporate daddies, but I'm not going to let that fact sway my review. All right, let's get started. So the first thing you need to know is that this lens is only available right now for Sony E-mount cameras. It's a full frame lens. It can work on a crop sensor Sony camera as well, but it's designed for full frame, and it's not currently available for any other mounts, which is, I think, unfortunate. That's really too bad because it's a very nice lens, and it would be great if Tamron were to roll this out, making it available for some of the other camera options that are out there. But for now, it's only available for Sony users. For everyone else, sorry. And this lens has a somewhat novel zoom range, going from 35 millimeters to 150 millimeters. And my first reaction was, well, that seems kind of odd. Like, it doesn't really go wide enough for it to get into the wide angle range, and it just barely gets into the short telephoto range. So my first thought was, well, gee, maybe this isn't going to be very useful. But I was wrong. I actually think that this zoom range is ideal for a number of applications, and this lens mates perfectly with some other zoom lens choices. And so I've come to the conclusion that this lens is actually ideally positioned to get a number of shots that might otherwise have been a bit more difficult to get. And for me, this is the kind of zoom range that before this lens was made, I never would have thought to myself, gee, I really need a 35 to 150 millimeter lens. But now that I have one, now that I have it in my camera bag, I can't imagine living without it. It really makes my life a lot easier. So I'm really happy to see Tamron taking a chance with this focal range, and I think they've hit a home run, and I'll discuss more why I think that as we go deeper into the review. But I think the first question we need to ask is, who is this lens made for? And when I first saw the lens, my first reaction was, well, this is made for event photographers and portrait photographers. You know, people who are doing wedding photography, for example. And I don't do that type of photography, but my guess is that a 35 to 150 millimeter range on a full frame camera is actually kind of an all-in-one lens. This is a lens that's meant to do a lot of things for people who are doing that types of photography. But I'm a landscape and wildlife photographer, so at first I was kind of wondering how I was going to fit this into my overall approach. But it turns out that this lens is actually perfect for both landscape and wildlife photography. Now, those of you who know me know that I am a wide-angle landscape shooter. I love shooting ultra-wide-angle lenses, and my go-to lens is my Sony 12 to 24 millimeter. But I also like to bring along a few lenses with me that allow me to reach out to more distant landscapes. So every now and then I want to do a short telephoto intimate landscape. Doesn't happen that often, but every now and then I've got the itch that I just need to scratch. And this lens is perfect for that. You know, usually you don't have to reach out that far for an intimate landscape. So more often than not, I find that like a 70 to 200 or a 100 to 400 is just a little bit too much lens, more than I need for most of my intimate landscape needs. And typically I would carry the 12 to 24, and then I'd have something like Tamron's 28 to 75, and then maybe something like a 70 to 200 millimeter lens. And that would be 3 lenses in my landscape kit. But now I can knock that down to 2 lenses. I've got my wide angle zoom, and then I've got the Tamron 35 to 150 for those rare times when I want to zoom in tighter and make an intimate landscape shot. So this has actually made my landscape photography bag lighter than it was before. I've got 2 lenses in the bag now instead of 3, and I find that those 2 lenses, the 12 to 24 and the 35 to 150, pretty much cover everything that I'm going to need. Now, in terms of wildlife, this lens is great for when you have closer encounters with wildlife. And when I was in Madagascar, I had quite a few of those, so I was using this lens a lot. And this lens actually mates perfectly with my Tamron 150 to 500 millimeter lens. And so this really simplified my wildlife kit as well, because if I needed extra reach, I would take out the 150 to 500. But when the animals were closer, and I had a lot of close encounters with wildlife in Madagascar, the 35 to 150 was perfect. It allowed me to go in to a short telephoto range if I needed it. If the animal kept on getting closer and closer, I could zoom out and pretty much almost hit the wide angle range. And so this just made my life a lot easier and allowed me to focus more on my photography. Now let's talk about the physical aspects of this lens. It's not too big and bulky. Now, as you zoom in and out, the lens barrel does move back and forth, which is, not the best design, but it's also not the end of the world. There's plenty of zoom lenses that are like this. Just gotta be careful to kind of keep this clean when it's extended, because otherwise you might get some dust coming back into the lens as you pull it back. The one thing that I don't like about this lens, and it's really more of a pet peeve, it's not that big of a deal, is that the zoom ring is on the inside. I really feel like the zoom ring for a lens like this should be on the outside, because with a lens like this, a little bit heavier, especially when you've got it extended, when you're shooting, you really want to support the lens by putting your hand underneath the front of the lens. So if you are going to be zooming in and out quickly because the wildlife is moving back and forth while you're shooting and you're hand holding, you're not really going to want to keep your hand here. It's a little bit less stable. So I wish that the outer ring, which is the focus ring, was instead the zoom ring. I think that would have been a more stable way of designing the lens. It would have been better ergonomically for photography. And it took me a little bit of time to get used to the fact that the zoom ring was on the inside part. So often I'd be shooting like this, and then I'd need to zoom. I just have to reach back and change my zoom. And sometimes I would just go ahead and just keep my hand here, even though I felt like it was a little less stable. So not a big deal. I just wish Tamron would contact me before they design their lens so I can tell them this stuff. So Tamron, if you're watching, you've got to get me involved with your design teams early on. Now, the wide open aperture of this lens is what really sets it apart. So it's an f2 to f2.8 lens. So when you're zoomed out to like 35 millimeters, it's f2. As you zoom in to 150 millimeters, it goes to f2.8. And these are both really wide open apertures. They let in a lot of light. And this allows the lens to very pleasingly blur the background, especially when you're at the long end of the focal range here. And so it's really great for that kind of photography, like portrait photography or wildlife photography, where you want to separate your subject from the background. You can shoot wide open with that very narrow depth of field. And the character of the out of focus areas is really nice. This is known as the bokeh, and this has got really good bokeh. I really like the way that out of focus areas look with this lens, especially when I'm shooting with bright spots in the background, creating specular highlights. I think those specular highlights look really nice. So to sum it up, I really like the character of the images that I'm getting with this lens. They really look great, and of course, that's the most important thing. This fast, bright, wide open aperture was also really useful for low light photography. When I was in Madagascar, I did a number of night walks where I was working in twilight or in low light, and I was hand holding to photograph wildlife. And having that bright, wide open aperture allowed in a lot of light, kept me from having to use super high ISOs, and it was really useful, really indispensable for that kind of photography. This wide open aperture is also really good for the camera's autofocus. It lets in a lot of light. And the autofocus motor on this lens seems to work superbly, so it's not really degrading or interfering with the camera's autofocus at all. The autofocus motor was quick and responsive, and when I was photographing wildlife in Madagascar, I wasn't having any problems locking on focus, even with fast-moving subjects, so the lens in that regard performed admirably. So let's turn to optical performance. This is a very sharp lens. It performs well in the center when it's wide open. The sharpness kind of falls off at the corners and the edges, but when you stop it down, it has great sharpness across the entire image frame. And for the types of photography that you're doing, these two characteristics actually work great. So when you're wide open, you don't really need to have that sharpness at the edges and the corners, because typically you're photographing wildlife or you're photographing an event, doing some portrait photography. So you've got your subject more or less in the center, and you're not really worried about making sure that there's extreme sharpness in the corners of the image frame. But if you're shooting landscape, then that sharpness in the corners is really critical. But if you're shooting landscape, chances are you're stopping down to a smaller aperture to get more depth of field. So you're getting that corner to corner sharpness at that point. So I think that the optical performance overall of this lens is really good. I was really happy with the shots I was getting, especially when I was shooting wildlife and I had that background blur. Having a really sharp primary subject with that background artistically blurred is really nice. It's a really nice contrast. It makes the subject stand out a lot. So overall, the optical performance of the lens is really great. It's to be expected with a lens like this when you're shooting wide open that you're not necessarily going to get extreme corner sharpness. Once you stop down a little bit, the corners sharpen up perfectly. So if you're shooting wildlife, if you're shooting event photography, you don't need that corner sharpness when you're shooting wide open. If you're shooting landscape, you get that corner sharpness when you stop down for a little bit more depth of field. So it all works out perfectly. So overall, I think that the optical performance of this lens is excellent. So if there is a negative check mark on this lens, it would be flare performance. And I love shooting into the light, shooting into the sun. So it's not the worst flare performance I've ever seen, but it's also not the best. So for this shot taken in Grand Teton National Park, you can see that there's some pretty bad ring flare around where the sun is. And to be fair, the sun was pretty high in the sky when I took the shot. The sun was setting, but it was still pretty high up there. And I was waiting for the moment when the sun was going to be better blocked by the clouds. And so it was shining very brightly through a gap in the clouds. And these are the kinds of conditions that really test a lens's flare performance. And so definitely I've used lenses that have better flare performance than this. This lens didn't do a great job, but even with a lens that performs very well shooting into the light, you've got to be careful with your technique to mitigate flare. You want to make sure that the sun isn't too high in the sky. You want to make sure that the sun is partially blocked by something to help reduce the flare. And so when I was much more careful with my technique, I thought this lens performed just fine. So there's a few shots where I was photographing baobab trees in Madagascar at sunset. As long as I was able to partially block the sun with a tree limb of the baobab tree, I was able to mitigate the flare or eliminate it completely and still get a really nice Sunstar effect. And as the sun got lower towards the horizon and it was being obscured partially by a lot of atmospheric haze, flare wasn't a problem at all, even though I was shooting directly into the sun and the sun wasn't blocked by anything. So definitely the flare performance of this lens could have been better. If you're careful with your technique, you can still shoot into the sun and get images that are mostly clean. But nonetheless, I think the mediocre flare performance of this lens is a black mark on an otherwise stellar performance. Another downside of this lens, depending on how you look at it, is its price. It comes in at $1,900 US, and that is pretty pricey, but it's a high quality lens. And when you buy high quality lenses, you're making an investment. And also this lens could potentially take the place of two lenses that you would otherwise have in your kit. So if you think of it that way, it's actually probably no more expensive than buying those two lenses, maybe even a bit cheaper. But I definitely think that this is a very high quality lens. It's well worth the price. So to sum it up, the pros of this lens are as follows. 1, superb optical performance. 2, it's a really useful focal range. And 3, it's got that bright open aperture that is really great for low light photography, for when you want to separate your subject from your background. And it also has a really fast and responsive autofocus that works really well with the camera's autofocus. It's not going to slow it down at all. So it's a really great performing lens. The cons of the lens are that the flare resistance isn't great and it's a bit on the pricey side. So this has become an indispensable part of my permanent gear kit. Whether I'm shooting landscape or wildlife, this is always in the bag. And if you're a Sony E-mount shooter, I think you should definitely consider this lens for your camera bag as well. I think you're really going to love it. And I think you're going to find it to be extremely useful. It's one of those lenses, as I said before, that you never really thought that you would need until someone made it. And then once you use it, you realize there's a lot you can use it for. So it's a great little lens, definitely a high performer. I definitely highly recommend this lens. I hope you have found this review useful. I'm Ian Plant, and thanks for watching.